Picture this. You are walking down a torchlit corridor in Imperial Rome, mid-1st century AD. The marble walls glisten with oil smoke, and beneath the sharp tang of wine and incense, there lingers another odor: sweat, sex, and rot. You hear the distant rattle of chains, a low moan from a chamber you dare not approach, and above it all, the laughter of a woman. Not just any woman. The most powerful woman in the empire, Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife of Claudius, and the most infamous name whispered in the streets, the baths, and the brothels of the Eternal City. Before diving into these forgotten stories of lust and depravity, consider hitting that like button, subscribing for more, and leaving a comment about where in the world you're watching from. These stories are not comfortable. They are not polite. They are history at its most obscene and unsettling. Messalina's name survives in the chronicles not as a queen, not as a mother, but as a warning. The poet Juvenal spat her memory into eternity with lines that describe her sneaking from the palace at night, barefoot, covered in a cheap blonde wig, entering a low-class brothel to sell her body under an assumed name. Tacitus tells us her appetite was so insatiable that noble women blushed, and men trembled at her approach. To Roman moralists, she was not merely a sinner, she was the embodiment of filth, the woman who turned the sacred body of the empress into a public latrine. But to reduce this to gossip is to miss the deeper horror. What was happening in Rome under Claudius was more than sexual scandal. It was a ritual inversion of the Roman order, a theatre where purity and filth exchanged masks, where the body of the empress became both an altar and a sewer. In anthropology, we would call this the collapse of boundaries between the sacred and the profane. In Roman terms, the pax deorum, the sacred peace with the gods, threatened by the unclean frenzy of one woman. Imagine one of the brothels where Messalina was said to perform. The sources describe her working until dawn, competing with the other prostitutes, refusing to leave until she was exhausted. The room would have been thick with smoke from oil lamps, the walls painted with crude erotic frescoes, the bedding damp with years of use. Men of every class, sailors, freedmen, slaves entered, not knowing or not caring that the woman they touched was the wife of Caesar himself. Each coupling was more than degradation. It was the empress ritually unmaking herself, deliberately contaminating the purity of the imperial body. The Romans believed the emperor's household was not just a private family, it was the beating heart of the state. The emperor was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, a man whose very body carried divine sanction. His wife was expected to embody pudicitia, sacred chastity. When Messalina turned her body into a public spectacle, she was not simply disgracing herself, she was polluting the sacred machinery of Rome, dragging the empire itself into chaos. But Messalina's depravity was not confined to the brothel. Suetonius and Tacitus both describe a notorious contest she staged against one of Rome's most celebrated prostitutes. The challenge was simple: who could take the most lovers in a single night? According to Juvenal, Messalina triumphed, exhausting her rival only when the lamps burned low and her body was covered in sweat and fluids. To the Roman elite, this was not entertainment. It was a horror story, a glimpse of a body so consumed by appetite that it resembled a beast rather than a woman. And yet, we must pause. Was this truly the unbridled lust of a single empress? Or was it the reflection of Rome's own obsessions? Roman culture was saturated with sex. Prostitutes lined the Circus Maximus. Graffiti on Pompeian walls bragged of encounters, and gladiatorial games themselves were riddled with erotic undertones. Messalina's acts were extreme, yes, but they were also the logical conclusion of a society where power, spectacle, and the body were endlessly entangled. She was both symptom and disease. Still, the horror deepens. Messalina's sexuality was not confined to anonymous lust. She wielded it as a weapon, destroying men who refused her advances, elevating favorites only to discard them. Ancient writers describe senators trembling when she fixed her eyes upon them, knowing that a refusal could mean ruin, even death. In this sense, her body was both executioner and oracle. To be summoned to her bed was both a privilege and a death sentence. The most shocking episode came in 48 AD, when Messalina went further than adultery. She staged an actual marriage while her husband, the emperor, was still alive. Her chosen groom was Gaius Silius, the handsomest noble in Rome. The wedding was performed with all rituals intact, in public, with witnesses. To the Romans, this was not just adultery, it was civil war enacted through sex. By marrying another man while Claudius lived, Messalina symbolically dethroned the emperor, mocking his impotence before the entire city. Tacitus records the Senate's horror. nothing was left but to destroy the emperor and seize control of the state. The line between sexual excess and political coup had vanished. The empress's bed had become the battlefield of Rome's future. But before we reach the climax of her downfall, we must dwell on the anthropological horror of her acts. In ritual terms, Messalina inverted every sacred role. Where the Vestal virgins preserved Rome's purity through lifelong chastity, Messalina desecrated it with public promiscuity. Where the emperor's wife should have been a priestess of domestic virtue, she became the high priestess of filth. The contrast is not accidental, it is the very reason her story survived. She embodied the terror of unchecked female sexuality, a chaos that Roman moralists insisted must be crushed to save the state. Picture again that brothel room, the flicker of oil lamps, the stink of wine and sweat, the slapping of flesh. And in the corner, unseen, perhaps a young scribe sent by the emperor's spies, watching, recording, ensuring that this story, half truth, half nightmare, would be whispered for centuries. Messalina is not just a figure of scandal. She is a figure of ritual horror, a reminder of how societies project their deepest fears onto the female body. And her story does not end in the bedchamber. It ends in blood, betrayal, and the silent gardens of Lucullus, where Rome finally turned on its empress. Imagine this, a marble courtyard in the heart of imperial Rome, the year 42 AD. The fountains murmur softly, scattering droplets across manicured laurel hedges, but the air is tense, heavy, carrying not serenity but whispers. The empire has survived the assassination of Caligula and the improbable elevation of his uncle Claudius, a man mocked by many as a stuttering fool. Yet beside this awkward emperor stands a young woman whose beauty and ambition seem limitless. Valeria Messalina, barely 20 years old, already empress of the Roman world. The chroniclers tell us that Messalina's lineage was impeccable. She was born of the great Valerii family, one of the most ancient patrician lines, her bloodline tangled with that of the Julii, the imperial clan itself. In theory, she represented the sacred continuity of Rome's nobility, a living vessel of tradition and stability. But in practice, Messalina would use that position to dismantle every boundary Rome held sacred. Her youth, her beauty, and her proximity to power made her both irresistible and terrifying. Claudius himself, historians agree, was no tyrant by nature. Bookish, hesitant, mocked in his youth for his limp and speech impediment, he survived Caligula's reign of terror by being underestimated, hiding in the shadows of the palace while others fell under the emperor's wrath. When the Praetorian Guard lifted him from behind a curtain and declared him emperor, it was more accident than destiny. But Messalina saw opportunity. Married to Claudius when he was still a private citizen, she ascended with him, and with her ascension began one of the most grotesque chapters of Rome's imperial story. In the early years of Claudius's reign, Messalina wielded her sexuality as an instrument of governance. Ancient witnesses Tacitus, Cassius Dio, Suetonius, though hostile, agree on one point: she was insatiable. But the horror lies not simply in excess, but in how she converted intimacy into domination. Senators found themselves summoned under false pretexts, wives and daughters maneuvered into her circle. Noble houses toppled not by sword but by bed. To resist her advances was to risk accusation of treason. To submit was to risk humiliation and ruin. One notorious episode recorded by Tacitus describes how Messalina fell in lust with Gaius Appius Silanus, a nobleman of great dignity and reputation. When he spurned her advances, she did not accept defeat. Instead, she plotted. At dawn one morning, the emperor's chamberlain, under her instruction, burst into Claudius's room, crying that Silanus had been seen in a dream attempting to murder the emperor. Moments later, Silanus was dragged before Claudius and executed without trial. Messalina had destroyed him simply for rejecting her. The empress's desire was no longer private, it was lethal. Anthropologically, this is the horror of inversion. The sacred household of the emperor transformed into a slaughterhouse, the bedchamber into a courtroom. Where Roman matrons were supposed to embody pudicitia, chastity, fidelity, the purity of the domus, Messalina became its profane mirror, a priestess of corruption who used the tools of sex and accusation to reorder society. And the city knew. Rumors spread through the Subura, Rome's teeming lower quarter. Prostitutes laughed in the taverns, claiming the empress undercut their business. Soldiers whispered that the palace had become a brothel, that the empress sold herself by the hour in open competition with the women of the streets. Whether these reports were exaggerations or malicious invention hardly mattered. The important thing is that they were believed. In a society obsessed with boundaries between noble and commoner, man and woman, purity and pollution, Messalina's behavior symbolized the nightmare collapse of all distinctions, but behind the gossip lay blood. Consider the fate of Poppaea Sabina, the elder, mother of a girl who would one day marry Nero. Poppaea was accused of immorality, her beauty drawing Messalina's jealousy. She was driven to suicide, her body another casualty of the Empress's hunger for domination. Other women, too, fell victim, not rivals in the Senate, but rivals in the bedroom, women whose husbands had attracted the Empress's wandering eye. Messalina's weapon was not only seduction but destruction. The historian Juvenal, dripping with venom, records that Messalina would slip away at night, leaving the imperial palace with only a veil to disguise her, entering a brothel where she worked under the name Lysiska, the she-wolf. There she would endure man after man until dawn, finally staggering back to the palace, the stench of sweat and lamp smoke clinging to her skin. When the emperor awoke, she would bathe, perfume herself, and take her place beside him as if nothing had happened. Juvenal insists she was not driven by necessity or secrecy, but by compulsion. She sought not pleasure but annihilation, the obliteration of boundaries between empress and prostitute, sanctity and filth. To modern ears, this may sound like moralizing slander, but in Roman eyes, the horror was real, visceral, political. The body of the empress was the body of Rome. To profane it was to profane the state itself. Messalina's compulsions were not framed as private vice but as cosmic pollution, threatening the Pax Deorum, the peace between Rome and its gods. Each act of lust was also an act of sacrilege. Picture the Senate, rows of men in white togas, many of whom had lost relatives to Messalina's schemes. They speak in clipped tones, afraid to raise their voices, for they know the Empress listens through her spies. A glance from her can topple fortunes. A whispered accusation can summon the executioner. These men, heirs of a republic built on honor and discipline, are reduced to trembling before a young woman who wields her body as both lure and blade. And yet Claudius remained blind or pretended to. The sources depict him as weak, ignorant, or deliberately oblivious, preferring to drown himself in banquets and scholarship rather than confront the corruption under his roof. In one sense, this blindness preserved him. By refusing to see, Claudius survived longer than emperors before him. But it also sealed his fate, for Messalina's ambition was not content with private scandal. It was growing, mutating, reaching toward the very throne itself. The anthropologist would say this: when the sacred center is corrupted, society compensates with ritual violence. Rome would not permit this inversion forever. The empress who turned her body into a brothel would herself become a sacrifice, her death a purification rite for a polluted empire. But before that bloody end, she staged one last performance, the most shocking inversion of all, her public wedding to Gaius Silius while still the emperor's wife. That act would seal her doom. Picture this: Rome in the autumn of 48 AD. The forum hums with merchants, litigants, and priests offering sacrifices at the altars of the gods. But beneath the normal rhythms of the city, a rumor coils like smoke. The empress, wife of the emperor Claudius, has taken a new husband, not in secret, not in the shadows of some sordid alley, but in full daylight, with witnesses, priests, and ritual vows. The bride was Messalina. The groom was Gaius Silius, consul designate, a man renowned for his beauty and ambition. The act was so audacious that even Rome, long accustomed to scandal, was stunned into disbelief. Tacitus records the scene with restrained horror. While Claudius was at Ostia, Messalina publicly celebrated a marriage with Silius. The ceremony, held in Rome itself, was not a clandestine tryst but a mockery of law and religion. The bride wore the veil, the flammeum, as if Claudius were already dead. The groom accepted her, as though he were emperor. The ritual of union, meant to sanctify the continuity of Rome's families, was transformed into an act of treason. The anthropological dimension is unmistakable. In Roman society, marriage was not merely a contract between two individuals. It was a religious rite, a binding of bloodlines, a reflection of cosmic order. To marry another while the emperor still lived was not simply adultery, it was ritual regicide, a symbolic dethronement of Claudius himself. Messalina had staged, with her body, a coup. Witnesses described the ceremony with mingled awe and dread. The lamps burned as at a funeral, the laurel crowns gleamed in the torchlight, and Messalina laughed, intoxicated by her own audacity. Some said she believed Claudius so weak, so pliant, that he would never dare act against her. Others whispered darker motives, that she and Silius planned not only symbolic union but literal usurpation, to replace Claudius and rule in their own names. The truth may never be known. What is certain is that the act shattered whatever fragile illusions remained of imperial dignity. Suetonius, ever eager for grotesque detail, insists that Messalina's lust was not sated even by this marriage. He describes her as burning with such a rage of lust that she always returned from her debaucheries unsatisfied. Whether this is slander or fact, the image is clear. A woman whose hunger was destructive not only to herself but to the empire around her. In Roman moral imagination, she became less a woman than a living emblem of chaos, filth embodied at the very heart of power. Meanwhile, Claudius was at Ostia, inspecting the harbour works, unaware or unwilling to hear what his wife had done. But the rumour spread quickly, carried by slaves, courtiers, and soldiers. The Praetorian prefect Narcissus, one of Claudius's most loyal freedmen, grasped the danger instantly. If Claudius hesitated, Rome might rally to Silius. If Claudius ignored the marriage, the empire itself would fracture. Action was needed, and swiftly. Tacitus describes Narcissus summoning the emperor's attendants, whispering the truth into Claudius's ears. Imagine the scene: the aging, awkward emperor, blinking in confusion, his stammer halting his words as the revelation crashes over him. His wife, the mother of his children, has married another man in the heart of Rome. His household has become a theatre of treason. Claudius, long mocked as a fool, suddenly faced the gravest decision of his reign. Back in the city, Messalina revelled. The sources tell us she continued to hold feasts with Silius, parading him openly as her husband. To her, the act was perhaps more than lust. It was ritual theatre, a deliberate inversion of the sacred order, a flaunting of her ability to reshape reality. In anthropological terms, this was the carnival of the profane, a temporary suspension of order, where filth masquerades as sacred, where the forbidden is enacted in public as if it were law. But in Rome, carnival had a price. The Senate was aghast. Senators who had once trembled at Messalina's summons now whispered of purges to come. If Silius became emperor, who among them would be spared? The empress's body, once the weapon of private domination, had become a public guillotine poised above the nobility. Rome braced for blood. Narcissus moved quickly. He rushed Claudius back to the city, surrounded by loyal guards, before Messalina could consolidate power. On the way, he paraded before Claudius a series of witnesses, freedmen, soldiers, senators, all swearing to the empress's crime. The emperor, still hesitant, still half in disbelief, murmured that he would summon Messalina and hear her defense. But Narcissus, knowing hesitation meant death, insisted there was no time. "If you see her, you are lost," he warned. The machinery of retribution had begun to turn. Picture the palace that night. Messalina, still flushed with triumph, feasts with Silius, wine staining her lips, music echoing from marble halls. Servants move anxiously, sensing the shift in power. Outside, the Praetorian Guard assembles, their armor gleaming in the torchlight, their orders clear. Rome, which had indulged her depravity for years, was ready to strike. The anthropological logic is simple. When pollution overwhelms the sacred center, society demands a sacrifice. The empress who had turned her womb into a brothel, her marriage into treason, her body into a weapon she herself must be cut out, a scapegoat to cleanse the empire. The blood of Messalina would become Rome's purification. But the final horror still lay ahead. When the trap closed, when Claudius finally gave the order, the empress fled into the gardens of Lucullus, begging for mercy, clinging to illusions of power that had already dissolved. And there, amid the statues and hedges, surrounded by soldiers, she would face the end. Picture this: the gardens of Lucullus in the chill of an October evening, 48 AD. Once the pride of a conquering general, the gardens were a maze of marble colonnades, statues of gods, and fountains whose waters whispered in the moonlight. But that night, they were no place of beauty. They were a trap, a waiting chamber for death. Here, the Empress of Rome, Valeria Messalina, crouched in terror, her fine silks disheveled, her hair undone, her lips trembling not with desire now but with panic. The news had reached her like a thunderclap. Claudius knew. The emperor, so often blind and pliant, had been stirred at last by Narcissus and the Senate. His praetorians were on the march. Silius, her new husband, had already been seized. He begged for mercy in the forum, offering to confess, offering to face trial. But there was no trial. His blood ran quickly, his body discarded, the first offering in a purge meant to cleanse Rome of the empress's pollution. Tacitus paints the image of Messalina's desperation vividly. She rushed to the Via Ostia, seeking to intercept Claudius before he returned to the city. She mounted a carriage, dragging her children with her, weeping, crying out that she was still his wife, still the mother of his heirs. She ordered her allies to plead for her. She herself prepared to throw her body at the emperor's feet. But Narcissus had foreseen this. He warned Claudius that if he saw her, her beauty, her tears, her body, those weapons she had always wielded, he would falter. And so the emperor was kept apart, shielded from her presence, his heart steeled by the voices of those who despised her. Back in the gardens of Lucullus, Messalina now waited with only a few attendants. The moonlight revealed not the empress triumphant, not the harlot triumphant, but a woman cornered. Her body, once the symbol of unchecked appetite, was now trembling flesh, vulnerable and small. Anthropologically, this is the scapegoat moment. The polluted body cast into the wilderness, awaiting sacrifice to restore order. The woman who had inverted the sacred order with her orgies and her marriage must now herself become the victim whose death would wash away the stain. The officers arrived at the gardens, led by the freedman Evadus. Tacitus tells us Messalina begged to speak with Claudius, to see him one last time, to plead her case. She still clung to the belief that her body could sway him, that her tears could undo the machinery of state. But the order was clear: no audience, no appeal. She was to die here, quietly, away from the forum, her blood hidden in the shadows of the gardens. Imagine the scene. Messalina, her knees on the cold earth, her children weeping, the soldiers standing in rigid silence, waiting for the act to be done. Tacitus records that a dagger was handed to her. She was told to end her life, to perform the ritual of suicide that Roman nobles had long used to claim dignity in death. This was her last chance to control her fate, to die as Lucretia had centuries before, a woman undone by sex but redeemed in death. But Messalina faltered. Her hands shook, her courage gone. She pressed the blade against her breast but could not drive it in. She sobbed, moaned, begged for time. The officers grew restless. Evadus cursed her, calling her a coward, dragging her upright, shoving the blade into her hand. But the Empress of Rome, who had once strutted naked through the brothels, could not meet death with dignity. She collapsed in tears, her body quaking with terror. In the end, a soldier did what she could not. With one swift stroke, he drove the sword into her body. Her blood spilled onto the garden earth, mingling with the roots of Lucullus's flowers. The body of the Empress, once the most feared and desired in the empire, now lay lifeless, her face pale, her mouth frozen in a final, silent scream. Tacitus, in his cold style, records it without sentiment. Her life was taken. Suetonius is harsher, reveling in her shame. Juvenal sneers that even in death, she was still unsatisfied. But for Rome, this was not merely gossip, it was ritual purification. The polluted body had been sacrificed. The inversion had been corrected. Claudius, in the Senate, was told of her death while feasting. He gave no response. He asked for more wine. The empire had moved on, the empress discarded like refuse. Anthropologically, this death was essential. In the Roman imagination, the body of Messalina had become the embodiment of filth, the source of cosmic disorder. By killing her, Rome performed a collective exorcism. Her corpse was the offering that cleansed the empire. But the horror lingers. For years afterward, poets, historians, and gossipers returned to her story, not out of pity, but out of fascination. She had become a monster of memory, a symbol of female lust weaponized, a lesson carved into Rome's moral imagination. Picture the gardens now, long after the soldiers have gone. The moon still shines, the fountains still murmur, but in the grass, a dark stain remains where her blood soaked the soil. The flowers that bloom there the next spring are nourished by that blood. Silent testimony to the empress who made her body the empire's greatest scandal. Imagine this. The day after Messalina's execution, the sun rose over Rome as though nothing had happened. The markets opened, the Senate assembled, sacrifices burned on temple altars. But in the palace, in the hidden chambers of the imperial house, a silence hung heavy, the silence of absence. The empress was gone, struck from life, and soon, from memory. Her name, once spoken with both lust and fear, was now a dangerous whisper. Claudius, when informed of her death, reportedly made no public outcry. Suetonius insists he asked only for more wine, as if her erasure were simply another piece of palace housekeeping. Tacitus adds that he showed no grief, and within hours, courtiers were suggesting new brides to fill the vacancy she left. The empire had consumed her, expelled her, and was already hungry again. In anthropological terms, she had become the sacrifice whose destruction restored equilibrium. Once killed, she no longer mattered, her function was complete. But the horror lies in how swiftly Rome turned the page. Messalina's allies were purged, her lovers executed, her name scratched from inscriptions. Her children, Britannicus and Octavia, remained under Claudius's care, but their mother's fate was never spoken of openly. Rome, a city that prided itself on remembering, chose in this case to forget. It was damnatio memoria in practice, if not in law. To speak her name was to invoke pollution. Better to bury her beneath silence. Yet the silence could not last. Human memory is stubborn, and scandal is immortal. The poets and historians could not resist turning her into a cautionary tale. Juvenal mocked her as the prostitute empress, selling her body to sailors until dawn. Tacitus, though colder, painted her as a woman consumed by greed and lust, who had nearly unseated an emperor through marriage-bed treason. Suetonius relished her grotesqueries, turning rumor into permanent record. Each chronicler, though hostile, ensured that Messalina's shadow would haunt history forever. Consider the paradox. Rome erased her officially, but preserved her obsessively in text. This duality reveals the anthropological truth of the scapegoat. She was destroyed not to vanish, but to serve as a permanent warning. Her corpse was buried, but her story became ritual instruction. This is what happens when the sacred order is inverted, when purity becomes filth, when the empress becomes the harlot. She was Rome's monster, necessary for the empire to define its boundaries. The consequences rippled outward. Claudius, left without a wife, was quickly maneuvered into marriage with Agrippina the Younger, niece of his predecessor Caligula. If Messalina represented lust unchained, Agrippina represented ambition weaponized. She would guide Claudius, poison him, and place her own son Nero on the throne. Messalina's fall, in a grotesque way, opened the path to one of Rome's most infamous reigns. The cycle of corruption and violence did not end with her, it only mutated. But let us pause to consider the deeper horror. Messalina was not unique. The sexualization of power, the weaponization of desire, the collapse of boundaries between sacred and profane, these were not accidents of her personality. They were features of Rome itself. In a society where the emperor was godlike, where the imperial household was the sacred center, the body of the empress could never be merely private. It was always public, always political, always charged with cosmic significance. Messalina's fall was less her own downfall than Rome's ritual purging of the chaos it had itself produced. Picture again the gardens of Lucullus, weeks after her death. The fountains still flow, the statues of gods still stand, but in the earth lies the body of a woman once called Empress. No monument marks her grave, no priest offers libations, her name is not invoked in prayer. She has become, in Rome's imagination, a ghost, a reminder of filth expelled, a warning not to cross the fragile line between order and chaos. And yet, centuries later, she remains alive in our memory. Not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a political actor in the complex machinery of empire, but as a figure of horror. Her name became a synonym for sexual corruption, a byword for lust so uncontrolled it threatens civilization itself. That is her legacy, not power, not love, but a caution carved in fear. The anthropologist would tell you this: every society invents monsters to define its limits. For Rome, Messalina was that monster. Her body was the battlefield where purity and filth collided, where the sacred domus became a brothel, where marriage became treason, where desire became death. Her execution was not just political, it was sacrificial, a cleansing ritual written in blood. And so we end where we began, with a body. Picture it. The pale corpse of Messalina sprawled in the moonlit grass of Lucullus's gardens, a dagger wound leaking her life into the soil. Around her, the silent statues of gods watch with stone eyes, indifferent, eternal. The laughter that once echoed in brothels and banquets is silenced. The empress who mocked Rome with her appetite has become Rome's offering, its expiation, its scapegoat. The warning endures. When power and desire entwine unchecked, when the sacred becomes indistinguishable from the profane, the result is always horror, always blood. Rome learned this lesson in the body of its empress. Will we?